individualized supports for our children. In addition to that, and complementary to that, and please, I am very supportive of those wonderful individual supports we all develop, but to complement that, it is, I want to propose that we really look to creating safe and supportive school communities to harness the power of that community to also support student learning and those individual supports that we have in place. Lastly, there is this reflection and action planning component. So we have a shared understanding that helps us understand how our kids learn and behave. There is harnessing the power of community to support school success. And then there is this reflection and action planning component, which allows us to identify local issues within our community and take doable, locally controlled actions to address them. So I want to start with a very brief overview of the shared understanding. And the shared understanding component was covered a lot by Nicole in the conference in October. And so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but I just wanted to make sure that we all had a shared understanding of some of the important concepts that underlie trauma and its impact on student learning. And the first one of these pieces to understand is the prevalence of traumatic experience. You know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the ACE study, and I provide you here with a slide that gives you some of the frequencies of adverse childhood experience among the group of individuals who participated in the ACE study. You know, this was done by Kaiser Permanente HMO in San Diego, California. And I like this particular study because the individuals in this study come from a relatively high socioeconomic environment and present with a number of privileges. And so they are, if you will, the study to me represents a baseline of what this frequency or prevalence of these adverse childhood experiences would be. And I've been talking, I'm hoping you've had a chance to look at this slide and to see some of these percentages. Physical abuse at 28%.
Megan, I have a lot of
sexual abuse at 21%.
My meeting,
So,
is it 120?
to do a folder.
I know, so we don't have the, so, yeah. Eric's not here for 120.
Maystar, you are coming through.
So I'm gonna watch my webinar till.
Your video.
Yeah.
Where was I? So abuse, physical abuse at 28%, sexual abuse almost 21%, 15, 16% male, 25, 26% female. Neglect, almost 25% of the cohort. Substance abuse, almost 27% of the cohort reported. Witnessing domestic violence, watching my mother being treated violently, almost 13%. And so as you look at these numbers, I'd like you to take a minute and think about your own school. And I'd like to think about your own school and ask you to think about what percentage of the students in your school do you think have at least one category of adverse childhood experience? And I'd like you to take a few seconds just to think about that. And as you think about it, let me move to the next slide and show you what the ACE study found out, which is the ACE study found that fully 64% of the individuals in this study had at least one category from the 10 study of adverse childhood experience, almost 2/3 of the cohort. And if these are the numbers, and the data has been replicated a number of times, then there are clearly those of us listening today that have had some of these experiences, and obviously a number of our students have these experiences too. The point here is that the prevalence of traumatic or adverse experience is much higher, I think, than most people prior to the ACE study would have assumed, would have thought about. And again, I think it's important to understand that the ACE study does not cover all, it only covered 10 specific categories of adverse experience, and it left a number of categories out, including chronic illness, community violence, death of a parent or a sibling, a number of different categories. And Nicole brought to our attention the Philadelphia study that really looked not only at some of the traditional ACE studies like emotional and physical abuse and witnessing domestic violence, but also looked at some additional categories to get a better sense of a more robust look at what these adverse experiences are and how prevalent they are. And a couple of things I want to bring up from that Philadelphia study. One is that the abuse numbers are significantly higher than they were in the original ACE study. The physical abuse is up 25%. Emotional abuse is almost 3 times what it was reported in the original ACE study. Domestic violence, as reported in the Philadelphia study, is 50% higher. And finally, having a member of your family incarcerated, looks to be almost 2.5 times higher than it was in the original ACE study. So again, it reinforces how prevalent these issues are. When you add some additional categories such as witnessing violence in the community, feeling discriminated against in the community, and living in a neighborhood where you don't feel safe, where you can't trust the others in your neighborhood to take care of you, you see that these additional categories add significantly. And at the end of the Philadelphia study,
He would say anything.
sense of the overall number of those who have at least one category of adverse childhood experience approaches 80% as opposed to 60%.
I was like, hey, at least she says something.
Maciak, your mic is on and we're hearing what you're saying. I would appreciate if you could mute it. Thank you.
She was so.
So let me ask the
How did you
question.
notice her? Because the way she had turned her head, the glasses.
What is trauma?
Yeah, and then I was like, sure.
And
otherwise, she just blended in so well. And she was so still.
I apologize for pausing so often, but I am very distracted by the conversation. So if I ask you what is trauma, I think the important pieces to keep in mind about trauma as we go through the shared understanding is the fact that trauma is not an event, but rather a response to an event. And it's a response that is characterized by our ability to cope being overwhelmed, and that we are really having feelings of helplessness. I feel I am in danger. I don't feel safe. And so that these are what make up a traumatic experience. And if you think in terms of trauma and its impacts, it is this triggering of this safety system in our bodies, this limbic system, this survival brain, if you will, that has a significant impact on the developing child and on that child's ability to succeed in school. So how does that work? And so Ms. C. Bennett, your microphone is on and we're getting feedback. Could you please mute it? Thank you. The impact on brain development is definitely influenced. Brain development is influenced by environmental stimuli. And that as we grow and experience things, our brains adapt. And so if you think of a newborn child and visiting a pediatrician, the pediatrician will often say, provide this child with positive stimulation. Speak to them even if they can't speak. Show them bright colors. Play beautiful music. Help them see and understand, all these different experiences. And as they do that, the parts of the brain that are stimulated by those experiences are the parts of the brain that grow and develop. And so if my experience set includes significant amounts of traumatic, or if you will, adverse experience, that I am constantly triggering this fight, flight, or freeze response. This survival brain is constantly being called upon. And so instead of developing that thoughtful brain, that learning brain, that brain that can compare and contrast, what we are in fact developing is our survival brain. And as that happens, as we have these repeated triggering of that survival brain, the threshold for the stress that will trigger that is lowered, and we have much more easily triggered fight, flight, freeze responses. And so that mild to moderate stresses, for example, don't forget we have a test next Friday, can trigger a full-blown fight, flight, or freeze response. And so students who come to school with a significant amount of adverse experience often come with this very lowered threshold for triggering this fight, flight, or freeze, or if you will, entering that survival brain, opposed to being able to operate within the learning brain. This chronic stimulation of the limbic system can also impact brain structure and brain utilization, but let me just provide a couple pictures instead of prattling on about it. This is an MRI slide of a student's brain, and you can, if you look at the
I listen to you. My volume's off, so.
of the picture, you can see the large gray area at the bottom of this slide, which is the student's cerebellum. And that cerebellum is part of this limbic system, this fight, flight, or freeze system. And that limbic system in this student is silent because the student's blood's been stained in a way that if they have blood infusion into a brain system, which is activation of the brain system, it would show red and green. And you can see in the cerebellum, which is representative of the limbic system, that survival brain, if you will, that there is no red or green. If we look at the same slide of a student with a known history of traumatic experience, you see that that limbic system is lit up like a Christmas tree. You're looking at a picture of the neurobiology, the neurophysiology of hypervigilance, of that student who is right on the edge, to whom you might say good morning to, and you get an unexpected response, to whom you might say, don't forget we have a spelling test on Friday, and again, you get an unexpected or not constructive response to that. So at this point, you know, adverse experience is prevalent. It can impact the neurobiological development and operation of the child. And so I guess the next question is, what does this look like? So a student who is in your school operating in survival brain, what do you think that looks like? And so I'd like you to take just a few seconds right now and think about what this would look like with a student in my school who's operating in survival brain, who's coming into school having that hypervigilant brain in operation. So take a minute to think about what that might look like. And I encourage you to think about more than just behavior. And so if we can be in that mindset, let me talk some about what the impacts are. Because the impact of trauma on student learning is not only just behavior, which is where most of us initially sort of gravitate to in terms of that description. It can look like a language-based learning disability. It can look like memory problems. It can look like a student who's struggling with self-regulation. It can look like a student who's very well regulated. And it can look like a student who struggles developing relationships. You know, on the academic side, significant traumatic experience can impact a student's core abilities. For example, language, written, spoken, read, receptive, expressive, all language can be impacted, as well as nonverbal language. In addition to that, in addition to language, it can also impact memory, particularly sequential memory, cause effect. The other piece on academic performance is that, could you please mute your mic? Thank you. The other piece on academic performance is learning process. So if you think of executive function and the issues related to executive function, you know, executive function is goal-directed behavior. And so I have a goal I want to accomplish. I develop a plan to accomplish that goal. I execute the plan. And then I step back and say, how did that work for me? And if it worked, I store it away and I pull it up next time I have that goal to achieve, or I want to achieve that goal. And what I just described is a remembered, sequential, cause-effect set of steps and actions that help me achieve my goal. So if I struggle with memory, if I struggle with cause-effect, sequential memory, language, that executive function piece is not going to be as effective as it would be in other students. So there are those academic impacts of traumatic experience that I think are important to keep in mind. The second area of potential impact that I want to talk about is behavior. And I've talked a little bit about students who are impulsive, students who are hypervigilant and overreact. Don't forget, we have a spelling test on Friday. You can get an overreaction to that. There are also students who've learned that if they push back, if they lean into that we can if, I'm sorry, there's a sign that just came up, I apologize. That students, there are some students who present that if they oppose or they push back, they can begin to exert some control over what's going to happen to them. And that ability to begin to exert control through oppositional behavior and others can be reinforcing to them, because if you think about traumatic experience and being in that survival brain, it's being able to exert control that can have a tremendous reinforcing effect on them. The other piece about presenting behavior, so you've got these folks who are hypervigilant and overreacting, you've got folks who are oppositional and pushing back. The third group is a group I think that's important to remember is a group who presents in class as connected, who presents in class as hardworking. And these are students who have learned that if they do what is expected from them, they can fly under the radar. And that flying under the radar is how they keep themselves safe. And that there are students in our schools right now, and I imagine there are students who probably are aware of some of their adverse or traumatic experiences. There are probably other students you suspect, but I'll also guarantee you there are students in your school now who are going through experiences that we have no way of knowing what they're going through, and yet they're going through that and they come to school and present in ways that mask it, but yet it is still having that effect on them. The last piece I want to talk about is relationships, because all these pieces that impact academics, all these pieces that impact presenting behavior also impact their relationships. And so think of a student who is that hypervigilant, overreactive, impulsive student. We just don't see it with staff and classroom interactions. You can see that with the student interacting with other peers. That student who is oppositional, who pushes back, who needs to be in control, can also be a student who struggles with student interactions. And so the impact of trauma on learning is not only in terms of behavior and dysregulated behavior, but it's about academic performance and it's about relationships. And so if you pull all these pieces together, some of the core pieces of this shared understanding of the impact of traumatic experience on student learning is how prevalent it is. Very large number, in fact, the vast majority of our students have experienced at least one category of adverse childhood experience, that it can have significant impacts across a broad range of areas, including academics, behavior, and relationships, the ability to develop and create connections. And that these, if you will, maladaptations to the school environment occur based on normal and natural processes that are designed to help that student stay safe. So students who grow up in environments with high levels of adverse or traumatic experience, their neurobiology, their behavioral approach is designed to keep them safe in those environments. And that oftentimes those approaches and strategies are not aligned with what would support and keep them safe in school. And so what we have is students who come to us who are not available to learn, who don't come with the set of skills that we would like them to have. It's sort of that round peg, square hole. And if we don't recognize and understand the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning, we don't have the knowledge base to understand how this student, why this student is struggling and what's happening. And so that understanding becomes critically important to being able to see and truly appreciate how all of our students learn and how all of our students behave. The real issue gets to be then, having this understanding is what do we do about it? How do we address these impacts? And there are two critical elements of this. The first is to be thinking in terms of the whole child, if you will, that student-centered model of success. And this is fairly common among a lot of educators. I don't think this is particularly novel information. I'm going to kind of review our basic model of that, but then I want to spend a lot of time, the most of my time, talking about how we can develop, or if you will, utilize the power of community to support student success. And when I'm talking community, I'm talking school-wide as well as classroom-based. The other piece, the other point I want to make as I move forward from here is that as we talk about whole child, as we talk about leveraging community, I encourage you to think in terms of the benefit this has for all students. This work is not about identifying yet another subset of students and providing them with specialized instruction. It is in fact about being very conscious and reflective about the communities within which our students operate, both within the school as well as the classroom. So in terms of whole child, we think in terms of whole child in these four areas. This work comes from a lot of the work done by the Childhood Trauma Group at Children's Hospital. They developed the ARC model, attachment, relationships, and competence. And so we think in terms of competencies, and when you think in terms of competencies, I encourage you to think in terms of Gardner's multiple intelligences, not just sort of those academic competencies, but the artist. Think in terms of that musician, you know, individuals that have talent in art and music are really pretty incredible to me, given that I really don't have either of those talents. I certainly appreciate music and art, but am not able to produce it. You know, I had a roommate in college who wanted to be in a band, and he went out and bought a guitar and taught himself to play in a couple months and was in a band within 4 or 5 months of making that decision. He's a very gifted musician, and that's talent that I just don't have. Think of those kinesthetic kids, those kids that can dance, that can play sports, that can do things with their bodies that are just pretty impressive, you know, those islands of competence, all those competencies that our kids bring. Then I think in terms of relationships and social networks. And I would ask you to pause for a moment and think about your own social network, your families, your colleagues, your friends, groups you belong to, special interest groups, etc. Think about those networks of relationships and how important those relationships are to you and to who you are and how you operate. And those relationships, I think, are very important. We're going to come back to that whole relationship piece as we talk about the importance of community. The third element is self-regulation, and self-regulation of emotions and self-regulation of behavior. And in self-regulation, you know, if you think in terms of Dan Goleman's concept of emotional intelligence, he talks about social skill as a combination of self-regulation, being able to pick and choose behavior that is aligned with my perception of a social situation. So it's social perception, it is self-regulation, it is perceiving the social situation, choosing the correct behavior, if you will, within the context of that social situation, that those two converging create social skill. And both self-regulation and social perception come from a common root, and that common root is self-awareness. And the importance of kids to learn, of anyone, not just children and students, but of anyone to learn self-awareness and to be self-aware is critically important, not only to self-regulation, but to the social skill and the development of relationships. The last element of the whole child I want to talk about is physical health and well-being. You know, initially we took the competency, the relationships, and the self-regulation right out of the ARC model from Children's Hospital, and we went into various schools and found out very quickly that we were missing a fourth element, and that's the physical health and well-being of the student. You know, and again, I think of myself in the morning going to work when I'm feeling 100% and I'm healthy and I'm up. It's like I'm going to work. Let's do the business we have to do. And I think our kids are the same way. When they're feeling good and healthy, I think that they can come in and be in a position to attack school. Then I think about myself when I'm not feeling so well, when I might be at 65%. And maybe the reason I'm going to school is there's a meeting that took me 2 months to plan, And if I don't go and attend that meeting, it'll not happen until the next school year. And so I get myself up and I go to school, and I'm really not anywhere near 100%. Those days when I'm going in, my mantra isn't bring it, let's do this. My mantra is do no harm. And again, I think students, kids are the same way. And so you have this whole child, and I talk about whole child, and I talk about each of these as separate components, but we all know how interrelated they are. That student who comes into our class at the beginning of the year, who has good academic skills, is in a much better position to develop relationships, to be able to self-regulate in that they're not going to be challenged or stressed in the ways that other students might who don't have those particular competencies. A student that has a wide network of relationships and is socially connected is in a much better position to work with any kind of academics that might be a struggle for them, is part of that community and feels connected, can be very powerful. Then you think just in terms of basic physical health and well-being, the importance of kids being fed. You know, the number of schools that do breakfast in the classroom and do it for good reason. And schools that may not, or teachers in their classroom who might have extra snacks for those students who don't have a snack at snack time, and knowing the importance of helping that student, you know, be fed and have some nutrition. So these all interact, and the importance of the whole child is oftentimes the route to academic success is not necessarily just more time in learning. And I say just more time in learning. I am a complete fan of time in learning and want to be very supportive of that. But how do we think in terms of whole child to make sure that that student comes into that time in learning in a position where they can actually be available to engage and learn? So you have that whole child piece. And now I want to shift to, so you have that shared understanding of the impacts of trauma, the prevalence, the impacts, you know, understanding the whole child. And so then how does that work into, or how do we then leverage the power of community to support that child? The research on the importance of community is there. It started with Mary Harvey in '96 and has been supplemented in a number of ways. I mean, if you look at John Hattie's work on effective classroom practice, one of the most highly effective classroom practices is that relationship between the teacher and the student, and that student's connection to that classroom community. So community for individuals significantly impacted by traumatic experience, the single most significant resiliency factor you can provide them is meaningful connection to community. And for students, schools and classrooms are communities, major communities for them, usually the most important for all students after their family. And so helping students feel safe and connected to that community, which is to each other, peers, as well as to adults everywhere in the school, is an important part of helping them, or if you will, providing them resiliency in the face of some of those adverse experiences that they're having. Additionally, the importance of community. So it's important from the child and connecting the child to the community point of view. I think it's also important from our professional practice point of view. I mean, as high quality as so many of the teachers are that I work with, there are always students who struggle to be successful, students who we struggle to connect with. If we address the needs of our students as a community, we have a much more robust set of supports, much more robust set of individuals to reach out, connect, and make it work. You know, I think of a middle school I worked with, and it's been adopted by a number of schools from elementary through high school. But as I was talking to them about the importance of community, they took yellow stickies, you know, those Post-it notes, and they put the name of each student on a Post-it note and put those Post-it notes up on a whiteboard at their next team meeting. And then they said to each other, so let's go up and pick off those students we truly feel connected to. Not necessarily, I mean, they knew all the kids, so it wasn't who I know, but it was who I feel really connected with. And when they completed the exercise, there were 5 yellow stickies left on that board. And 4 of those 5 yellow stickies were high-frequency discipline kids. And they looked at each other and said, so how can we work together as a team, as a community, to reach out and connect with these students? And they made it their objective over the next couple of weeks to do that reach out and to connect. And as those 5 students became more connected to the adults on that team, 3 of those 4 who were high-frequency discipline kids, the intensity and frequency of the discipline issues dropped precipitously. And so again, it is that power of connection, that power of community. I think the other piece around the importance of community is, and I mentioned it earlier, is we never know who all the kids are who've been affected by traumatic experience. You know, we know some, we suspect others, but there are always students there who we just have no idea about. And so the importance of community, I think, is a critical piece in addressing the needs not only of students impacted by traumatic experience, but by all of our students. And again, I ask you to think of yourself. Think of your communities. And when bad things happen, where do you go? You know, I go to friends, I go to family, I go to colleagues, I go to my communities. And when good things happen, where do we go to celebrate? We go to friends, family, colleagues, community. Community, we are communal animals. That is who we are. We are communal beings, and the importance of community is even more heightened for those individuals who have significant levels of adverse and traumatic experience. So, if community is important, what is a safe and supportive school or classroom? And a safe and supportive school or classroom is a school or classroom where all students feel safe, welcome, supported, and valued. It's a pretty straightforward definition. And it's a place where addressing the learning of all students is the educational mission. And I'm not sure that any of us would have any arguments with any of this in terms of what is a safe and supportive school and classroom and the definition. The issue isn't the definition, the issue is how do we get there? And so I want to talk specifically about how we can get to creating safe and supportive school communities. And how we get there really comes down to a process. It is about identifying where we stand at this point in time. So now we're going to take some reflection, we're going to take current status and identify urgencies to act, really look at our readiness, and readiness not in terms of should I act or shouldn't I, but readiness in terms of what actions are we in a position to take. Identifying what those positions are, and then measuring the impact of those actions. And that this process of identifying urgencies and taking action is guided by a set of norms and values that are inherently safe and supportive. And we call these norms and values the attributes. These attributes are the norms and values that, as we use them to guide how we think about action and how we take action, we are weaving them into the fabric of our school. And it is this weaving of these norms and values into the school that creates a safe and supportive school. And so let me talk first about what these norms and values, these attributes are, and then go through in some detail what are the steps we can take to develop a shared understanding, identify urgencies, and take action. So the attributes, the first one is that we have a shared understanding of the impact of traumatic experience on student learning. It's an incredibly important piece to have. I've talked about that some, and I'm not going to spend more time talking about it, but we need to have that shared understanding to understand how our kids learn and to really fill out how our kids behave. That we support students, the whole child, in the 4 domains. We support them in terms of competence, self-regulation, relationships, and physical health and well-being, and that this support is not just providing for, but it's also explicitly teaching skill. And again, a lot of folks currently do that, but I think it's important to see that we're dealing with whole child and that we have a shared understanding of the impact of traumatic experience on student learning. The third of these 6 attributes is helping students feel safe and valued in every way. And helping students feel safe and valued You know, I would give you this example of a student who is run sideways against discipline, has crossed a boundary, and has been engaged in some form of discipline. And as schools, we usually have, you know, a really good handle on what that protocol looks like, how that student steps through the disciplinary process. We have very skilled people who can de-escalate kids. And so after that event has occurred and that student is now de-escalated, how do we then re-enter that student into school, into the classroom? How do we make sure that that slate is clean and that that student is in a position where the reset button's been hit and they have clean slate and can begin again? And it is in that helping that student see that the slate is clean, that that mistake has happened, it's behind us, and we're now moving forward, that I think we express real value for that student, that we want you in our classroom, in our school, you belong here. And oftentimes when people will have very specific issues around, protocols for what the rules are and when a student crosses that boundary, what happens, that particularly during the course of the day, if that reentry protocol is not as detailed as the pullout protocol, we can often run into situations where kids don't feel that it's really been settled out. And that reentry protocol is really, how do we reenter that student into the community? Where is the staff person involved at that point in time? Has the student voice been heard? Have they been able to talk about how they viewed the situation? And have they been able to hear how the staff viewed the situation? And is there a way to identify or articulate different approaches or strategies we might use moving forward to support that student and that educator, so that the next time that this happens, we're not necessarily in a position where we're just replaying history. So it is that students feeling safe and valued. And then the last piece is connecting students to the school community. You know, I talked about that middle school example where they had put those yellow stickies up on the board and had pulled them off and came down to those 5 students, and the significant positive impact of their reaching out to connect with those 5 kids who they were not connected to. And I think that that is just a great example of the impact and the import of connecting students to the school community. These 4, if you will, of the 6 are really student-based attributes. The 5th one is about us as educators and professionals. It is working together as a team. And I begin with the staff within the building. You know, it's interesting when we are working in schools and staff are identifying urgencies. One of the urgencies a majority of schools have identified is how can we as a staff work together, work better together, be on the same page, feel that we are aligned and pulling in the same direction with our kids. And so this working together as a staff, coming together as a team, being on the same page is incredibly important. And once we've done that, then engaging parents and, you know, supporting that parent engagement as well as connection to other community agencies. The last attribute, and again, these attributes are the norms and values that guide our action. The last attribute is being flexible and innovative. You know, I think of some districts, in particular an urban district I worked in, and there, you know, after the Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, they had a large Puerto Rican population in the city, and they knew that they would have an influx of school-aged children who had come from this horrific experience of the hurricane striking Puerto Rico. And they got ready for that in a very proactive way. They saw that it was coming, they knew it was going to be an issue, and so they set up peer mentors, bilingual peer mentors who could receive students who came in. And if they had no knowledge of English, the student mentor could translate, could really help them feel connected and support their feeling comfortable in the community. They also pulled together materials for that student to have, as well as for parents to have, if a guardian or parent came with them, so that when the influx of students came, and it did come, that they were prepared for that and had prepared for it in very straightforward, but in ways that were doable, practical, and manageable by that school community. And so these attributes, if you will, these 6 norms and values are what guide our action. So I wanted to go over those norms and values, if you will, prior to really talking about the whole action planning process. And so the action planning process, I'm going to talk about it in 4 components. The first is readiness. And readiness is not a binary choice of either or. It is really about readiness for what? And that shared understanding, readiness for, coming together as a community, readiness for action planning. And oftentimes the readiness of a particular school might be to really engage in some shared understanding. And I know that Donna has a 1-page leadership resources component that includes some resources that would be available to support staff in developing shared understanding of the impact of traumatic experience on student learning. So the readiness piece is readiness for which stage. And in terms of readiness, readiness to go begins first with motivation and priorities. Why is it we want to do this and we're motivated to do it? And then really looking at capacity. I worked in a school and they were very excited to create safe and supportive, and they had just started PBIS the previous year. They were going in the current year to implement NPSS protocols and practices. They had also this current year just introduced a 2nd step social skills curriculum, and they wanted also to take on safe and supportive. And we actually deferred them to the future and suggested that what they might do right now is try and find some time to begin to develop a shared understanding among staff. So it's really understanding where is the space and the resources to begin to take this on. And I think to bear in mind that safe and supportive schools, it's not a sprint. It's not something that we're going to accomplish in a month or 6 weeks. It is a reflective, community-based process that is an ongoing element. It gets woven in. These norms and values, this work gets woven into what we do in our school on a regular basis. And again, on the readiness side, oftentimes the beginning is really looking at a shared understanding and deepening that through professional development, PLC, book groups, within the school, whatever it is going to develop that shared understanding. And that I encourage you to feel empowered to initiate this process where you're ready to do it and as you are ready to do it. Early on, one of the things that you want to pull together is a steering committee. If you're going to become safe and supportive, it needs a committee, it needs a group within which to live. And some schools allocate a portion of time of an existing committee to address that. Other schools develop a standalone committee to address it. Whatever is going to fit the norms and culture of your school, I think is fine as long as they have dedicated time and space to really deal with safe and supportive trauma sensitive. So readiness in that readiness stage. And again, Donna has a 1-page piece of resources that certainly would get you going in some of this. The second piece is reflection and urgency. And reflection on, where are we now? And what are the things that we feel an urgency to address? And oftentimes after the shared learning, we'll ask some folks some basic questions about where they think the staff would like to weave safe and supportive activities into the school and what those roadblocks might be to doing that. So we get some information usually when we do the post-training. And then we also suggest that schools sit down and really look at their school-wide data. Schools, you all, collect and analyze significant amounts of data. You probably already do a lot of the data review now, but it's to make sure that we have a sense of what is our data telling us, to reflect on that data. In addition, there is a guided reflection tool that is available. And again, that 1-page sheet has it's available through DESE, the Department of Ed and Elementary and Secondary Ed. And that tool is available for free, and the way to get at that tool. And this reflection tool is a series of guided reflection questions. It's inquiry-based. It's asking you to think about operations in a number of different areas, from professional development to policies, procedures, and protocols, to academic and non-academic classroom resources, etc. And so the idea of this reflection is to see how folks are responding after their shared understanding, to look at the data that is currently collected within your school, and then to complete a guided reflection tool to really a structured inquiry into helping you identify where my urgencies might be. And so that once you've identified those urgencies, then the issue becomes one of action planning. And again, the steering committee, which is operating, been developed and is operating, is really taking the lead in developing this action plan. If you will, you've identified urgency priorities, select the 1 or 2 most significant priority areas, and then for each of those areas, 2 or 3 actions per urgency. We have an expression, small is the new big, and it has a couple of meanings. The first is small actions have big impacts, and I would just throw out the almost trite example of just making eye contact and saying good morning to a student can have a significant impact on that student's day and our day as well. So that small actions have big impacts. The other piece of this is, as you're beginning to create safe and supportive and you're developing an action plan, start small. Don't overreach. It is the infusion, the guiding of these actions by the attributes, the norms and values that is the cornerstone of creating safe and supportive schools. So it's less about how many actions and more about the thoughtfulness and quality of those actions that I think are going to move us along that path. And so when we've defined or we've identified those actions for those identified priorities, then it's a matter of how do we implement and how do we measure our impact, both quantitatively, obviously, and qualitatively. And that this process of action planning, coming from those urgencies and that reflection, that we are constantly communicating with the full staff. If you will, the steering committee is working for the full staff and making sure that we've gotten the urgencies identified right, that these actions that we're identifying are actions that are doable and make some sense. And so that it is this urgency and action planning piece that I think is important. So once we've gone through action planning, then it's review, reflection, and renew. What are our outcome measures? How are we doing? What does it mean? All of the traditional kind of reflective reviewing, and that our actions then modify, feed, identify the next set of urgencies to begin to run through this action planning process. And so that is, if you will, an overview of the process for creating safe and supportive. And I guess I wanted to spend a little bit of time now showing you what this might look like. What small actions people have taken that can have significant impacts. You know, the red envelope, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the red envelope, but it came from a school that was having a discussion around the balance between confidentiality and sharing information. And it was a heated discussion between staff and general ed staff and leadership and support staff. And that their solution was that, confidential information can't be shared, but we certainly as staff need to be aware of kids who things are happening in their lives, good, bad, and the ugly, and that as things are happening in their lives, we should be aware that they have these things going on. Not necessarily the details, but just a note like an FYI. And they did this by sending out a red sheet of paper folded in half with the student's first name, last initial, and the name of the person that held the information. And they would send that to every staff person who would see the student, so that every staff person got that red envelope, if you will. They would have used envelopes, but they were too expensive. Red sheets of paper were much cheaper. They, utilized that red envelope to give everyone an FYI or a heads up. a school that was receiving new students, and a lot of new students decided to use, excuse me, an interest survey, so that in addition to the traditional information you would receive in the cumulative record, they also had a sense of who the student was, what they liked doing, what they thought they were good at to support staff getting to know that student better and helping that student connect with peers who might share similar or related interests and activities. We've talked about the whiteboard example at the middle school. In terms of creating whole school community, some actions that people have taken is morning greetings. And morning greetings at the classroom door. And it's an approach and a strategy that is now commonly used, which is providing students an option that they can, 5 or 6 options of greetings they can choose from a sheet outside, laminated sheet outside the classroom door. And the teacher is there and the student comes up, selects the option, the greeting option they want, whether it's a hug, whether it's a high five, whether it's a wave, some contact and non-contact greetings, and that they have that greeting, make eye contact, have the greeting, and then the student enters the room. Another piece that's been utilized by some schools in supporting creating whole school community among staff is just straightforward things like how we team off in full school meetings. If we're going to be doing some work, and it's possible to, rather than break down into our traditional groupings, whether by grade level or people I know, to cut across grade levels, to cut across areas of the building. So I get an opportunity to work with some folks I don't know and to have that opportunity to get to know them a little better. Again, creating that sense of community just by knowing and working together. Another school looking to support homework completion developed initially what they referred to as homework detention, so that if students did not have their homework, they would be assigned to homework detention, where they would meet with staff in the school, and the staff would support their homework completion while teaching them a study skills curriculum. It was a very proactive approach to try and teach students study skills, but somehow got put in the context of homework detention. And it didn't work. Kids weren't going to come. It felt very punitive. Staff weren't pleased with it. And so they got together to talk about it and felt that the study skills curriculum and the whole idea were good, but it just needed a refresh. And the first refresh they did is they changed the name to Homework Club, and thought that that would be a pretty good idea, although it still was going to take place after school. And so there was this sort of detention component to that they felt, the students would probably see through and weren't sure how much of an impact that would have. At the same time, they had been compelling students to come to Homework Club, and a teacher suggested that they invite students to Homework Club. And this invitation concept was a very difficult thing for folks to discuss, because the sense was that if we didn't compel them to go to Homework Club, that few people would go. And the decision was made to invite, because they felt that they would rather have a smaller number of students who had accepted the invitation and were amenable to learning the study skills than necessarily spending a lot of time compelling students to do their homework. They were just about to break up and had agreed to that invite approach when one of the teachers in the room talked about her own experience after school, where she would go home, walk in the back door, mom would be there with cookies and milk, they'd chat about the day, she'd then complete her homework and go out and play. And that became, in addition to the Homework Club, that became kitchen table. And so homework detention then morphed into Homework Club by invitation. And the first part of Homework Club was a snack, juice, cookies, getting to chat with the various teachers and instructors who'd be working with you on that, and became a very positive part of the school. In fact, they ended up having many students who did their homework requesting to come to Homework Club. On the discipline side, discipline that is predominantly punitive without any learning component certainly sets a boundary. And I want to be clear, kids are accountable, there need to be boundaries, they need to live within those boundaries. But so often, I think we assume that students, if they receive a punitive consequence, have the skill to substitute alternative behaviors, and I'm not sure that that is necessarily accurate. And so it's how do we find those places to teach, explicitly teach those skills or those strategies so that students can learn different ways to respond in situations where they might be stressed or there is conflict. Some schools, I think of high schools that have turned their detention into collaborative problem-solving, social skill development opportunities. I would encourage you to think in terms of how you utilize that time with students during discipline, and is it a time that not only can be used to de-escalate, but a time that also can be used to problem solve and teach skill, as well as developing protocols for that student re-entering classrooms, et cetera. So again, what some folks have done, small is the new big, they've taken existing opportunities and used it to teach students yoga, meditation, mindfulness, collaborative problem solving, think kids. So taking those what are usually punitive time frames and turning them into explicit positive strategy development time frames. Some schools, in fact, staff in general, as you move down this process of being safe and supportive, often ask, so what is it? What is safe and supportive? And it can be hard to give a specific definition beyond the formal one I gave early on. And so some schools have really made a list of what it looks like and sounds like in school. It's greetings in the hallway. It's asking students what happened. It is a smile. It is looking at parts of the day that have been perhaps somewhat disorganized and bringing some organization to that. So it is that for our community, this is what it looks like and this is what it sounds like. And then the last piece that came up, and this is really a classroom technique, which is Zentangle. Zentangle is a type of structured doodling. And a teacher was looking for a way to help her students re-enter class after lunch and recess. She tried a number of things, and it wasn't that her kids were out of control, it just, she felt took her too much time to really settle them in. And the art teacher suggested that she try a right brain activity like Zentangles. And Zentangles is like I said, a structured doodling activity where you take a white sheet of paper, you frame it with a black marking instrument, you create some spaces by different lines, etc., and then you fill in the spaces created with those doodled lines with different cross-hatching, checks, etc. And you get this abstract black and white design. And the teacher tried that, and it actually worked quite well. And in fact, not only did it work quite well in helping her students settle that right brain activity after recess, but it became a source of pride in the classroom as they every week would regenerate a Zentangle quilt that they hung on the wall and invited other people to come in and look at. Again, creating the sense of community within that classroom. Here's an example of a fairly advanced Zentangle quilt from one classroom. They've been doing it for quite a while, and a lot of the students have become quite adept at it. So, safe and supportive. I've outlined the process. We've talked about the shared understanding, the importance of harnessing the power of community. What are the impacts? And the research on this is very clear that as you gain this shared understanding of the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning, that added dimension of understanding our kids does result in shifts in practice. That shift, if you will, in thinking and understanding impacts practice, and it impacts it in the following way. First, there are very positive changes in the school culture. That you have positive learning approaches to discipline. The discipline becomes more about relational accountability rather than punitive consequence. That students and staff get a better sense of affirming their cultural identity and promoting the sense of belonging and being part of, and significantly improved relationships among staff and students. And I emphasize that among staff because I think that's so often a piece we get so focused on the kids, that sometimes we forget about ourselves and the importance of our coming together as a community. The other pieces that come out of it are, again, that reflective piece. The teachers begin to feel that their voice is heard and included. The teachers, educators become much more reflective, that we have a shared ownership, and that teacher leaders, as that teacher voice is heard, the teacher leaders and teacher ideas come forth more openly and more readily. And the last piece, and it's really quite functional, that research shows, is that identifying these community issues and addressing them in this way provides a significant number of very creative, low-cost solutions to what I would refer to as the local issues within the school, to really address what is of concern within your school community and being able to do that in a creative and low-cost way. And I know it doesn't have maybe some of the pizzazz of some of those earlier research-based outcomes, but it is a very empowering place to be in a school where we feel we can work to identify and collectively address what's important to us in our community. So if I'm to summarize, I guess the place I would start is that a reminder that this work benefits all students. This is not about identifying a subset, but it's good for all students. And it comes from this shared understanding of the impact of traumatic experience on student learning, that this is the majority of the students in our school. The ACE study would show it as 64%. The Philadelphia study would show it as 80%, having at least one category of adverse childhood experience. And that shared understanding of the impacts of what that can do to a child's preparedness and ability to engage in learning in school, engage both on the academic side and some of the issues there, engage behaviorally either through dysregulation, and lastly, in terms of relationships and being able to reach out and become a part of peer groups and the school community and develop meaningful relationships with staff. That the way we do this is through whole child. That the whole child, that oftentimes the key to academic success might be connection and relationship. That the key to self-regulation might be academic success. And so thinking in terms of whole child and addressing the needs of that whole child. And then we also think in terms of whole school, whole classroom, we think in terms of our communities. That our communities, if we can imbue into our communities the attributes being shared understanding, all students feel safe, supported, and valued. All students are connected, and we think in terms of whole child. That we work together as a staff and as a community that's looking to engage parents and other community resources into the school. And that we have permission to be proactive and to be innovative in identifying and addressing our local issues within our school. And that is through this taking action, to address our local issues, that we infuse these norms and values into how we think about our school and how we think about taking action. And over time, it becomes how we do things. And again, knowing that small is the new big. Don't have to make the big splash. The small action to address the local issue and concern is the big action. And so I thank you very much for spending some time with me this afternoon.